Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthias Risse, and I am the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I am also the Bertolt Beitz Professor in Human Rights, and thereby now occupy a chair whose inaugural holder John Ruggie once was. And whatever distinction will be associated with this chair, it will always be first and foremost that John was that inaugural holder. The Carr Center is honored to be hosting this webinar on the legacy of John Ruggie, this tribute to John. John passed away on September 16th this year, just a month shy of his 77th birthday. There was a memorial for him on Harvard campus a couple of weeks ago, and we also decided to host this additional online event for all those unable to join us on that occasion. John Ruggie succeeded in combining a life of penetrating and stage-setting scholarship in political science with equally significant achievements in the world of political practice. In fact, a key theme in his research agenda was the ways in which ideas, norms, and institutions can genuinely change the world. And in his work for the United Nations, he himself became a kind of norm entrepreneur whose goal it was to bring change to the world, especially in the domain of how the private sector around the world took seriously its human rights obligations. John was one of the most visible people in the human rights field here at Harvard, and by bridging scholarship and practice in this way, he also stood for the very mission of the Harvard Kennedy School in truly exemplary ways. As a scholar, John was best known for a number of highly influential essays that traced the trajectory of the post-World War II political and economic order. This was an order that, owing to the critical role that multilateral norms played in its development, could not be reduced to the role of state actors. Successful explanations for change, that is, could not be reduced to accounting for how states deploy what power they have to pursue their interests. The overall outlook behind John's thinking is known as constructivism, and it is named for the idea that it is indeed through a complexity of ideas and norms that influence different types of actors that our social world is shaped or constructed. After John served as the Dean of Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed him to the newly created position of Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning, which John then held from 1997 to 2001. His first endeavor was gaining the support of governments for what became the Millennium Development Goals. He then turned to the role of the private sector, in particular the responsibility of multinational corporations in improving human rights, labor standards, the environment, and anti-corruption practices. This effort resulted in the UN Global Compact. John left New York to join the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School in 2001, but a few years later, in 2005, Kofi Annan, whom John greatly admired, appointed him as the special representative of the Secretary General for Business and Human Rights. This appointment was later renewed by Ban Ki-moon, something that is actually quite unusual to happen, and that reflects the high regard in which John was held across two different UN administrations. This appointment set in motion a line of work that eventually produced the guiding principles on business and human rights that were unanimously endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011. These principles also became known as the Ruggie Principles. They contain demanding due diligence standards for businesses in the human rights domain, and they also set out the duties of states to ensure that businesses respect human rights. And that means legal duties of states and responsibilities of business are seen as complementary by the Ruggie Principles. John himself tells the story of these principles in his highly accessible 2013 book, Just Business, Multinational Corporations and Human Rights. The book is especially good in relating what it actually takes to be a successful norm entrepreneur within the institutional framework of the United Nations, where things can get accomplished only through sustained coalition building, through smart and personalized diplomacy, and through a whole lot of travel. The book makes clear that what had been achieved up to then, as remarkable as it was merely, and that's a formulation really from the introduction to the book, was merely the end of the beginning. For the last decade of his life, John was much preoccupied with pushing beyond that end of the beginning. And many talented and committed people have aided him in his efforts up to that point and have carried that torch ever since. I'm honored to be able to welcome a distinguished panel of experts now who were both academically and personally close to John. In the subsequent discussion, you, the audience, will be able to put in your questions and comments in the Q&A function, which we will screen. So you really are very much encouraged to participate then also in our reflections and discussions here. The panel will be moderated by my colleague, Katherine Sickink, who is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Katherine is a distinguished political scientist, one of the world's leading experts on human rights and global governance, and a major contributor to the constructivist outlook herself that also founded John's work. And in fact, John was Katherine's dissertation advisor at Columbia University. She will be joined by Anita Ramos, who is the Henry M. Jackson Professor of Law and also the Director of the Sustainable International Development Graduate Program at the University of Washington School of Law. Anita, who will actually be joining us from Geneva today, is one of the leading academics and a genuine pioneer in the field of business and human rights. She currently also, and that's why she is in Geneva, also serves as the immediate past chair and current member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And so Anita very much carries on John's work at the United Nations. Katherine and Anita will also be joined by Rachel Davis, who is the Vice President and a co-founder of SHIFT. SHIFT is a nonprofit mission-driven organization headquartered in New York City, and it is the leading center of expertise on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, so the leading center of expertise on the Ruggie principles, and thus is a major actor in pushing the business and human rights movement much beyond that aforementioned end of the beginning. John Ruggie served as the founding chair on SHIFT's board. Rachel, who will actually be joining us from Australia today, so it's the middle of the night there. Rachel has led work at SHIFT over the last decade on standard setting, human rights and sports, financial institutions, conflict and international law. And before SHIFT, Rachel actually was the legal advisor to John during his UN mandate. And thus Rachel has been a long-term partner in John's work on business and human rights. But before turning over to Katherine and this distinguished panel, it is my very special privilege now to introduce to you and to turn over the screen to Mary Ruggie. Mary, who is John's lifelong personal and intellectual companion. Mary is also a distinguished sociologist with a special expertise in comparative health policy. And Mary has served as professor and chair of the sociology department at Columbia University before both John and Mary Ruggie moved to the Harvard Kennedy School in the early years of this century. And with that, over to you, Mary. Welcome.
Thanks, Matthias. I'd like to start by thanking Katherine and Matthias for inviting me to introduce today's tribute to John and his work, the first of what I hope will be many such webinars around the world. In the last couple of weeks, there have been 2 memorial services for John, one here at Harvard, as Matthias mentioned, and another in London. In addition, earlier this week, the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights based in Geneva celebrated the 10th anniversary of the guiding principles and held a special session in honor of John. Anita was the moderator. There were a number of common themes in the speeches. One of the most important, articulated by all of the speakers, as well as Matthias just now, was that John was a brilliant scholar, a theorist of international politics and global institutions, whose academic impact has been profound. And there were some interesting observations on what happened to John, the scholar, when Kofi Annan appointed him to the position of Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning. Many speakers saw the link between John's legendary conceptualization of embedded liberalism and the Millennium Development Goals, the Global Compact, and the guiding principles on business and human rights. And everyone agreed that in his work at the UN, John was applying his ideas and putting them into action. But there was a lingering question that some people have asked John over the years, and a few people asked me after the speeches. How did he do it? How did John manage to be both a scholar and a practitioner? How did he make his ideas implementable? I'd like to refer to a comment that Mary Robinson made at the London Memorial that captures this sentiment. Mary met John in the late 1990s when she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and he was Assistant Secretary General. They kept in touch after John left the UN and came to Harvard. Then he reappeared at the UN in 2005 as Special Representative of the Secretary General for Business and Human Rights. Mary said she was a bit taken aback because she knew that John was not a human rights person and that the field was relatively new to him. Nor was he a lawyer, and the task at hand required some familiarity with legal systems, she felt. But she gave him the benefit of the doubt. After a few years, Mary saw that John and the team he had put together, many of whom were young, dynamic lawyers, were beginning to do some really important work. In fact, far more important than anyone expected. Mary sort of suggested that the keys to John's success as he and the team developed the guiding principles were the fact that he was quite smart, of course, had excellent diplomatic and organizational skills, and yes, his charming personal qualities helped. But I'd like to add that John's academic acumen was also part of the mix. From my perspective, Rachel can correct me, what the team seemed to be doing at times was holding a seminar. They were engaging in a back and forth exchange of ideas. They were problem solving, and everyone, including John, was actively learning. John led the group by doing what he's always done. He stood back and looked at the big picture. He placed actors and social forces within alternative frameworks of understanding. He reflected on some of the lessons that history has taught. He listened to people and detected ideologies that were blocking progress, as well as passions that might move mountains if guided in the right direction. He envisioned possible paths toward goals that were themselves evolving. Katherine could correct me here, but I think this was social constructivism at work. John approached the world as a thoughtful, curious scholar, and he nudged the world to move toward improvement, especially in the lives of people who are adversely affected by social change. After the memorial in London, a longtime friend, an academic who is very familiar with John's earlier, more theoretical writings, but less familiar with John's work at the UN, asked me to chart and connect the development of his ideas and his policymaking and implementation, to clarify the connective tissues and evolutionary patterns. Others who are more familiar with John's work at the UN than his scholarship have asked me to do the same thing. That's why I'm glad to be here today. I look forward to working with today's speakers and others in various academic fields and professional pursuits, people who can do the mapping and connecting. As importantly, I hope I can help you to take John's ideas and work with them yourselves, to develop them further, and maybe usher them in a different but compatible direction. What a way to honor the legacy of a great mind. So again, I thank the Carr Center for starting what I hope will be an ongoing, exciting process for all involved. Thank you.
As Matthias said, I am Katherine Sickink, and I'm the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I want to begin first by thanking Mary Ruggie for her remarks, but also for helping us envision and organize this webinar. And I want to just say, I think that Mary has been too modest, as usual, in her remarks, because she was very much an influence on all that John did. In a book of essays he later wrote about his intellectual trajectory, something called Constructing the World Polity, John thanked the key people in his life who'd put him on his career path, and foremost among those, Mary, he said, for helping him realize his dreams. He also thanked his graduate school mentor, Ernst Haas, who first schooled him in the field of international relations, where he became, I think, an intellectual giant. So John Ruggie, as Matthias said, was my advisor, was my mentor, and later my colleague and a lifelong friend. And he was, as you've heard, a brilliant IR scholar and a great public servant. And I think the theme of this seminar, we already see it emerging, is going to be how John just didn't do those two things. He didn't just do both those things, right? Scholarship and high-level public service. They were intimately connected. And so the success of his policy efforts are not just due to his diplomacy, his collegiality, his humor, but also to his ability to just use his theory to craft, diffuse, and legitimate new sets of norms. So as Matthias already pointed out, John's early theoretical work was a forerunner of what we call today social constructivism. And for those of you less familiar with IR theory, I just want to take you back briefly to the early 1980s when I first entered graduate school and John was my professor. International relations theory at that time simply did not take ideas seriously. It's always a puzzle, isn't it, in our field, to think that scholars whose lives are devoted to ideas actually don't take ideas seriously as kind of an explanation for change in the world. And so international relations theory was dominated by realism and neoliberalism at the time. It focused almost entirely on states, and it was mainly thought about those states as motivated by their power and their interest. And so the explanations for change had to do, when states changed, when the system of states changed, or when the power and interest of states changed, the world changed. And so John's important contributions that began in early essays in the 1970s and 1980s was really about saying that, of course, power mattered. And he continued to understand the importance of power, but he thought that IR had gone too far in its aversion to ideas. And he pointed out that this came out of course, the post-World War II reaction against idealism. But he said that this aversion to ideas was responsible for the disciplines, and here I'm quoting, responsible for the discipline's poor grasp on the role of ideational factors in all kinds of international life. And here he meant what we call collective identities, norms, aspirations, ideologies, or ideas about cause and effect. And so in his entire intellectual career, John theorized about how to bring these factors back into theory in our field. And in that sense, he left an enduring legacy. So we've already heard about his most cited article, the one that we call, it was International Regimes, Transactions, and Change, Embedded Liberalism in the Post-War Economic Order. It continues to be today the single most widely cited article in the international political economy corpus. And there was that's actually a quantitative study that someone did of the most cited articles. So in it, John argued that international relations was the result of a fusion of what he called power and legitimate social purpose. So this was the way, this idea of legitimate social purpose is really bringing ideas in, right? And so John argued that changes either in power or the social purpose for which power was exercised could lead to change in international relations. And this would become, I think, a bedrock of constructivist thought. This notion that changing ideas or consciousness was a major factor in constituting change in the international system. Now, I want to say that John was also an amazing teacher, and so as Mary pointed out, his whole life was a seminar. But I've had the good fortune to be teaching one of John's flagship courses at the Harvard Kennedy School called Global Governance. So it's a course that he developed and that I have been teaching for the last 3 years. And John's worldview and vision permeate the very structure of the course. My students, when they finish the course, they almost always say that they said, I didn't know that global governance, they said, we thought that global governance was about managing the obvious problems already out there in the world. But they didn't realize global governance is also about setting agendas, framing issues, and creating and disseminating norms. But the intellectual bones of the class are like a map of John's real-world contributions, which was all about setting agendas, framing issues, and creating and disseminating norms. So the link between his theory and practice was evident soon after Kofi Annan appointed him as UN Assistant Secretary General. And he later recalled that the transition of this new job at the UN went, quote, surprisingly smoothly, because, and here again, quote, he said, it quickly became apparent that creative leadership in international organization is social constructivism in action. And John was a model of the theory he taught. He was a norm entrepreneur par excellence who made unforgettable contributions to making the world a better place. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Mary. And thank you for this invitation to be here today. I'm Anita Ramos, a professor, but a current member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I want to pick up where Katherine left off, which is to say, it is very apparent that John really married the world of scholarship and the world of international relations practice in his work at the United Nations with the guiding principles. In addition to the tributes that Mary Ruggie already mentioned, last week there was a tribute by the Business and Human Rights Journal, which is a scholarly journal that I and others helped start with Cambridge University Press. And we had a tribute to the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the Ruggie Principles. But as part of that, we also were able to celebrate one of John's last scholarly pieces that he contributed to a special anniversary issue focusing on the Guiding Principles. And once again, he's at the forefront of norm entrepreneurship with that piece, looking at the world of finance and investors and the role that they have to play in this business and human rights ecosystem. So treating investors as yet another actor in this world of norm creation. So I just want to say that we really see John throughout his career continuing to push the scholarly field. And there are many, many professors now. The fact that we have a field or an emerging interdisciplinary field of business and human rights is a true tribute to John Ruggie. He gave us that. So his scholarly legacy is very, very important. But we move to the guiding principles, and that's why I'm here today to speak about that. And I think the greatest tribute is that we just celebrated at the United Nations 10 years of the guiding principles, a decade of the principles in action. The United Nations Human Rights Council, which unanimously endorsed those principles in 2011, reaffirmed their commitment to those principles this past summer. And at this forum, which is the largest multi-stakeholder forum that the UN in Geneva has, so again, a tribute to John's vision, brings together civil society stakeholders, indigenous communities, business, and governments to talk about what they're going to do next. At this forum, we presented a roadmap for the next decade. So the working group, carrying forward John's legacy, has been able to take and move the guiding principles forward, as has Rachel Davis and her colleagues at Shift, to say that this is a living document and blueprint that we've been given that is not so overly prescriptive that it is not capable of evolving. It is a tool that we use to deal with new challenges, be it the pandemic or be it climate and a just transition. So I'll put in the chat later a link to the roadmap, but you will see very much that the working group, which is 5 individuals appointed by the Human Rights Council to implement the guiding principles. We work with governments, we work with companies, and we work with civil society all over the world on implementation, interpretation, and furthering the commitment to this idea that business must respect human rights. The challenges continue, and John saw those, whether it's an extractive company that is dealing with indigenous communities and wanting to open a mine, or whether it is a company that finds out that it has forced labor in its global supply chain. The problems are different, but the guiding principles are a tool that can be used across these different challenges. And that is the beauty of this architecture. Now, I'm a lawyer, but a legal sociologist. So in the world of law and society, it was not surprising to me to see that a framework that the UN was going to use was not only law, but norms as well, because law on its own is never going to move the mountains that we need to move to ensure that businesses around the world use human rights as their benchmark, not different local laws around the world. So it is that use of norms that really will build us a better institutional framework. And I'll just reflect on that, and I hope Rachel will as well, that in this last decade, we have seen that movement. John gave us those norms, but those norms then could be used. And over time, as we embrace them, we are now seeing binding regulation that is being developed in the European Union and in different European nations, focusing on the concept of human rights due diligence that he gave us. And I would just say that as we look and reflect on the challenges of the past 2 years in the pandemic, the guiding principles will help us future-proof. And this is why they are so important. That what we have seen during this very stark time is that businesses that have used the Ruggie principles to think ahead and anticipate the harms to people that may arise from their business activity, those companies reacted quickly and were able to put in steps to mitigate the harms to their workers, to take safety precautions, because they had tools and processes in place versus the companies that have not yet joined that guiding principles family. So it is really a great tribute to think about this as an everlasting tool. We've just celebrated 10 years. We are going to celebrate 10 more. And my last point is just that the other power of John Ruggie was not just his ideas, it was the power of his investment in people. He recognized important ideas wherever they came from. And I, as a young academic, had written quite a lot about, do companies have international criminal responsibility? He found my work, elevated it, used it, but again, helped bring these ideas to light. And the main thing is that he has such a large global network now because he invested in all of us. And that investment has reaped dividends because that investment in human capital means that there really is a world, a community of practice that are carrying forward these ideas. So that is what I think of when I think of John's contributions. Principles can be developed and put on paper, but the investment in the people that are going to carry those forward is the greatest gift to us all. So thank you very much. And I'll turn this over to, again, a friend and colleague, Rachel Davis, who it's been a pleasure to work with over these years as well.
Thank you very much, Anita. And thank you to Katherine, to Mary, and to the Carr Center for the invitation to join you today. I'm going to take advantage of what Matthias offered in terms of time and really use a full 10+ minutes because there's so much to say. But John was our founding chair at Shift, but he was also my co-founder, Caroline's, and my biggest champion. He was a mentor, he was a friend, and it's an honor to speak about his legacy, particularly in a session with Mary, who was his partner in every aspect of life, and who together with John really welcomed us as family. At Shift, we tend to think of time before and time after the UNGPs were endorsed. Before the UNGPs, we had no common language and we had no agreement among different stakeholders on what the respective roles of states and businesses should be, around which legal rules could then cohere. We were missing the norms, as Katherine and Anita have outlined. The guiding principles established a socially expected standard of conduct for business, but they were written by John with a clear eye to the evolution of this standard into a binding one, as indeed we're now seeing with a growing number of states adopting laws based on them and the potential for EU-wide regulation. But beyond the guiding principles themselves, John's work also shaped an entire field of scholarship, as Anita said, but also practice. There's now a growing community of people who can have and do have careers in business and human rights. And that's due to many people's efforts, of course, but John's was central. The guiding principles don't place limits on how that field may evolve in the future, but rather they create the enabling environment for it to flourish by giving it that central norm coherence. In addition, business and human rights is vital to meaningful progress on other very closely related agendas. Anita has mentioned ESG and reform in the financial space, but also more broadly on sustainability, climate change, and stakeholder capitalism. And John was at the forefront of making those connections and arguing for the centrality of human rights as those other agendas move forward. I'd like to touch on three essential attributes of the guiding principles that, in my view, are a direct reflection of how John approached his work and of his unique mind and character. And those three attributes are: first, the mutually reinforcing relationship between the guiding principles and law, to pick up on Mary's point. Second, their inherent flexibility and adaptability. And third, the importance of people's lived experiences in how the guiding principles are implemented. So on the first point, it's often observed that the guiding principles are not a binding legal text, but they're also far more than just a text. And that should surprise no one, given who their author is, as Katherine has observed. As John himself put it in a joint article that he, Caroline, and I wrote this year, the guiding principles, quote, authoritatively define a universe of discourse and establish its basic parameters and perimeters. Their constitutive elements achieve uptake to the extent that they have intrinsic persuasive power, inspire or justify prescribed conduct, and engender shared expectations of ends and means. The guiding principles transcend, end quote, I should say. The guiding principles, but I think that will be clear, transcend the binary of being either a purely voluntary or a purely mandatory standard. They set a soft law standard of conduct, and they assume that the standard will evolve and harden, and they encourage that progress. John was intrigued by what domestic and international law had to say on corporate responsibility for human rights harms and loved to dissect the latest legal judgments. Here in Australia, where we have a lot of rugged outback territory that we call the bush, we also have a term, bush lawyer. This is someone who isn't a formally qualified lawyer, but who sure argues as if they are. When I told John several years into knowing him that I thought he was a superb bush lawyer and explained what that was, he laughed out loud. Another point that has been made in the memorials that Mary referred to is John's ever-present sense of humour, which was one of the many delights of working with him. John deliberately brought lawyers into the process of developing the guiding principles, from in-house corporate counsel to major Wall Street firms to plaintiff lawyers who were pushing really groundbreaking suits against companies. And indeed, during his mandate, John co-authored an amicus brief with Philip Alston in the Supreme Court case of Kiobel against Shell, when the lawyers for Shell dared to misrepresent his position. John's contribution to the development of law was recognised by the profession itself, including by the American and international bar associations. And John respected the foundational role of the law, but he was never limited in his thinking by its confines, recognising that to solve a problem on the scale of the inequalities created by globalisation, we would need that and every other tool in the toolbox. The second aspect of the guiding principles I'd like to highlight is their extraordinary adaptability. So John was the author of the guiding principles, but anyone who knew him will know that he always said we when he talked about writing them or when he celebrated new evidence of their uptake or impact. And there are very few leaders of John's stature that can also match his humility, in my view. That we included the team of 8 of us that, as John said, made it across the finish line with him on the final guiding principles, but it also included so many others as well who contributed through research, consultations, or pilot testing. It included excellent minds like Anita's, of course. And John wanted as many good minds as possible around the table to pick up on gaps or highlight inconsistencies, although more often than not, it was John himself who did that. But the rigor of his thinking and the quality control that he imposed helped ensure that the guiding principles would stand up to the test of the sheer number of sectors and issues and contexts that they would need to be applied to. But to give one totally unexpected example, at least unexpected by me, the world of sport. The guiding principles have been integrated into hosting contracts for major competitions by FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, and other sports bodies. Now, while significant, this is somewhat analogous to companies including them in their contracts with suppliers and other business partners. What is really extraordinary, I think, is that the guiding principles are now informing the overhaul of rules governing the field of play. This can be seen in the recent reform of IOC guidance on the inclusion of transgender and intersex athletes in elite sport. The new guidance, issued just 2 weeks ago, breaks from past approaches by placing the burden on sports bodies to do human rights due diligence in making decisions about who is eligible, rather than just excluding those whose gender identity or gender expression don't conform to our cisgender norms. So athletes who are already more likely to be exposed to discrimination and harm. As John knew, what sport does can have major spillover effects on broader society. And I think this was one of the reasons that he was so excited about the uptake of the guiding principles by the likes of FIFA and the IOC. The final aspect I wanted to highlight is about the importance of other people's lived experiences. Watching John in action over the years I worked for and with him, it was clear that he was motivated, deeply motivated by empathy for people in all walks of life. He wanted to learn directly from them what solutions to their problems would work best, rather than just proposing or imposing answers from the lofty heights of the UN headquarters, or indeed the 5th and a quarter floor of the Balfour Building. And this commitment to understanding impacts from the perspective of those affected by them is, of course, at the heart of human rights due diligence. And it's what differentiates it from typical organizational risk management. It's also why the guiding principles, I think, are quietly but surely revolutionary. They expect companies to go beyond what they directly control, where they usually feel most comfortable, and to focus on the most severe risks to people in their value chains. And this involves looking at root causes of impacts, for example, at structural gender or racial discrimination, and how this manifests now in companies' operations and value chains. It also involves tackling systemic impacts like the denial of trade union rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. John's recognition, and as I later learned, his childhood experiences of the essential role of trade unions in fighting for their members' rights and balancing the power of business, is woven through the guiding principles. And his deep and genuine concern for workers is evident in the really deep and heartfelt respect that he received from many trade union leaders, just as he was met with respect in corporate boardrooms. And I got to see John's concern for workers' rights up close when we took a trip together with Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, to a migrant workers camp on the outskirts of Doha in 2016. John and I were in Doha to present the report he'd finished applying the UN guiding principles to FIFA, which became a blueprint for what the sports sector should do. And despite our hosts not wanting us to travel, John gamely jumped in the car with Sharon and her team and me to travel to a labor camp that was outside the scope of FIFA's direct World Cup operations, meaning that we weren't authorized to go there. But it gave us real insight into the egregious conditions for the majority of migrant workers in the country. We met with several workers, they shared their experiences, and we left before we exposed them to further risk. Back at the fancy hotel that we were staying at, John walked straight into the meeting room where FIFA's corporate sponsors had gathered in their suits, covered in dust, and laid out for them what we had seen and why they had to take greater action to address risks to workers beyond those directly involved in the World Cup infrastructure, because it was what the guiding principles expect. They took the message seriously and they acted on it because it was John, because it came from him. So in conclusion, we clearly believe that Shift's theory of change reflects that of the UN guiding principles themselves. And as I hope I've conveyed, they reflect so much of John. Along with many other allies in this growing field, we are proud to share his vision of a more just and a more equal world, and to really champion the pragmatic but principled roadmap that he has given us. So thank you, John, for making the path possible.
And thank you, both of you so much, Anita and Rachel, for those really, really excellent and thoughtful remarks. And we have already a question here from a member of the audience whose name is Mayu Arimoto. And I'm going to just read the whole question. I'm going to, it's not directed to any of us. I'm going to ask both Anita and Rachel if they would like to respond to it. And so Maya Arimoto writes, quote, "Today, it feels like the legitimate social purpose in international society that Professor Ruggie outlined is breaking down. The world seems dominated by two hegemons who do not necessarily act in the best interests of the international community, while the protections of human rights appear ever tenuous." How do you think Professor Ruggie would describe the change in the norms of world order today? And do you think that the framework of embedded liberalism still continues to function in today's world? And so, by the way, I also want to always invite Mary to step in if you have something you'd like to share as well. So it's open to all members of the panel right now. I don't know who would like to begin.
I won't presume to speak for John or how he would see it, but we did have many long discussions about what the change in China's position from 2011 and the endorsement of the guiding principles to today might mean or does mean. So a couple of reflections on that. In 2011, China supported the guiding principles, and they did so on the understanding, and John would often tell this story, that they were fine with them applying to the activities of Chinese enterprises abroad, but that the domestic sphere was to be considered differently in line with domestic norms. And that worked for the purpose of advancing the guiding principles. And indeed, there were some signs that of real progress on them and practical application in certain sectors. That's no longer what the picture looks like. And I think, one of the questions that we often get at Shift is there a point at which the theory of change reflected in the guiding principles, which prioritizes engagement, capacity building, coalitions to try to incentivize change, always with that objective of getting better outcomes for people? Are there circumstances? There must be. So what are the circumstances in which actually you have to move to a logic of disengagement? And then how do you use disengagement as a source of leverage while also ensuring that you don't contribute to further harms? And I think that is the paradox that companies are facing right now, certainly in relation to the abuses happening in Xinjiang, and potentially also in relation to other issues. But Anita and Mary, over to you to add.
And I'll just pick up very briefly. And again, Mary probably has, in terms of connecting this back to the theory of embedded liberalism, a broader perspective. I just came from a workshop that was at the UN yesterday, focusing on this issue of what companies should be doing in terms of responsible entry and exit, because the world has changed. And we think of also Myanmar as another example. So companies are grappling with how to use the guiding principles, how to use concepts like leverage in this world. But I would say, as we look at the shifting role of states, what the guiding principles and what John has given us is that the role of business has become ever more crucial and critical. So business as a key to set tone, to set expectation, and to focus on these issues is what we're seeing now. And so in that sense, while pillar one of the guiding principles is still there, the importance and the prominence of respect for human rights in the business community is where I think the human rights community may focus its efforts as we deal with these new shifts in power.
And I would just add that, of course, John was disappointed with some of the things that were happening in the world. The sentiment that was expressed, he expressed as well. But he did then do what he does. He stood back and remembered that a change is not a straight path. It does go back and forth. And remember that he developed the idea of embedded liberalism to try to account for what was happening after a war. Right now, some of the leaders in business are not quite as leaderly as they used to be, but others are beginning to pick up. And I think I was so impressed with what Rachel and Anita said in emphasizing things like evolution, flexibility, a living document. It allows for the fact that things don't happen in a straight path.
May I just add one anecdotal bit of support for what Mary just said? So there's the famous story of the founding of Nike, right? Where this the legendary business leader Phil Knight, who founded Nike after doing some studying about how the sports shoe, the running business would work out optimally in the 60s, and then basically took advantage of the possibilities of global supply chains then, right? And so they produced these shoes so very cheap, and they had them produced, the physical objects themselves, they had them produced in places like Vietnam and Indonesia. And when then there were protests around the treatment of these workers over the decades, so Nike was in the focus of attention of a lot of labor protests over a long period of time, Nike would always say, we do not make shoes. We just do not make shoes. We do something else, right? We produce a kind of image of urban cool, of belonging to certain circles, but we do not make shoes. We get the shoes from elsewhere, right? And that thought, they got away with that for a long time, but it would be completely ludicrous to say this today. And I think this is one way also of thinking how, in the bigger picture, how much progress there has been made.
If I could just add to that, Matthias, my goodness, I've got to start writing down some of the wonderful jokes that John would tell. Please, if anybody remembers the exact phrase, let me know, because it was at that meeting with Nike that some reporters asked Kofi Annan, why are you working with Nike? Rachel nodding, please help me say it right. And Kofi Annan responded, we don't need to work with angels. Something along that line, Rachel?
Absolutely. The angels don't need our help. That's it.
Angels don't need our help, is right.
So we have a couple of other questions here. And the next one I'm going to read comes from Denise Brown. And she says, could you please elaborate on the mentioned mapping that is being conducted in addition to documenting this measurable impact? I do hope we could draft a policy recommendation document to states, governments, UN member states, especially given the recent undertone and change on language of the most recent outcome document. Unfortunately, many countries and emerging markets continue to water down the responsibility of business, companies, and investors to respect. Okay, so pillar 2, their responsibility to respect. Perhaps with concrete examples, as a result of this mapping, we could make a case to business, but also states. Okay, so again, I want to open it up to the panelists. I'm not sure who'd like to begin this time, maybe Anita?
I'll jump in, about the working group, but I think there are different efforts at kind of mapping and trying to understand the impact of the guiding principles and how they are experienced today. I will put, when I finish here in the chat, 2 things. The working group did a report, which was a stock taking of the first decade of the guiding principles and the impact there. And then our roadmap, which was just launched on Monday, is sort of looking ahead. And in terms, I think Rachel really said it succinctly, is that what we now have with the guiding principles is tremendous progress. Having a common language that business, government, and civil society can use to speak about this idea of protect, respect, remedy, and respect for human rights is really tremendous. We've seen that. We've seen policy coherence where other major international organizations, such as the OECD, the International Finance Corporation, that we've seen this permeation of the guiding principles into other key parts of the global governance infrastructure, so that these norms have permeated into other places. And what we've also seen is that governments have taken the first step. So there is that issue of, is everybody interpreting the guiding principles in the same way? But their commitment at the Human Rights Council, which is translated into things such as national action plans on business and human rights, and then capacity building and what we call regional races to the top, which is really this sort of regionalization of the business and human rights commitment. We have today a forum in Geneva, but most of the world isn't going to come to the United Nations, including rights holders and people on the ground, to deal with the guiding principles. So what we have to do is bring the guiding principles to the regions, and we have regional fora, we have regional activities, and it's in this space that we're seeing the developments. The glass is half full, some would say, and the glass has gotten bigger as we know that the guiding principles are going to have to be used to deal with things such as systemic inequality and with things such as climate change and just transition. But I would say that having a common language and that expectation being one that is being pushed down into the local context is a tremendous, tremendous achievement. But to agree and say that, yes, we have to now move forward to ensure that that commitment is now put into action. And I think Rachel can speak to that piece, which is the how do we turn things into action.
So maybe just to add a word on that question, we've had a project for the last few years at Shift that John was extremely enthusiastic about, looking at how we currently measure the impact of human rights due diligence and other aspects of implementing the guiding principles, and how we can get better measurement, by which we mean measurement that actually helps us understand the change that this is having in rights holders, affected stakeholders' lives. And I remember so many conversations with John where he'd be reviewing, yet another set of ESG standards from an asset manager, and saying everything that's written in the S part and some of the G and sometimes something in the E, this is human rights. But then it's not being seen that way. It's not being given the rigor that the guiding principles bring to how we ensure respect for human rights through the way businesses operate. And so he was a champion, especially in the last few years, of, as has been mentioned already, of really trying to bring financial institutions, but particularly investors, into the space of better measurement that gets us closer to whether and what kind of change is happening for people on the ground, and looking at the practices and behaviors that companies actually undertake when they say they carry out human rights due diligence. The purpose of this was not to have policies and pieces of paper floating around and some person siloed in an office down the end of the corridor with the words human rights on their door. That was never the vision. It was to drive it into strategy, into business models, and into how the most significant decisions get made. And for that, we do need better ways of measuring what meaningful implementation looks like. But progress has been made on that even just in the last 3 years, and I'm confident that that's going to change even in the next 3.
So Rachel, just we may have some people in the audience who are coming somewhat to this issue and don't have as much experience as the panelists do. Can you just explain a little more what you mean by ESG standards? What's the E, what's the G, what's the S, and why they're so important and why John worked so hard on that?
Absolutely. It's like being asked to translate Australian, which is often a legitimate request. ESG standards, so this stands for environmental, social and governance metrics that many investors are now using alongside more traditional, purely financial metrics of corporate performance to evaluate the quality and the appeal, frankly, of different investments. And it really can help, is intended to help bring a sustainable lens to investment. So this company may be, giving a good financial turnover today or tomorrow, but will it be doing so next year or in 5 years or even in 10 years from now? Let alone how will this affect future generations, as we now know we need to think about in the climate space. So we've seen a boom in ESG particularly since the pandemic, but a lot of, when you dig into it, a lot of the metrics that are being used around the social part either are a bit generic, they don't make a lot of sense, they may not be very specific to the sector, and they don't really help you get a great deal of insight into how well or how seriously the company is managing human rights risks. So I hope that helps explain a little bit how this field of business and human rights is actually central to better decision making by investors.
So it relates directly to a question that's from the audience right now. And so that is Monty McCurchie has asked about a statement from Milton Friedman that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. How did Professor Ruggie, or how would Professor Ruggie respond and deal with this thinking now so prevalent in the current day political social publics?
Let me start taking that on to continue with what Rachel was just saying. John also tried to emphasize that ESG investing is not something that companies do necessarily. They do it not by themselves, is sort of what I meant to say, from the top down. He really wanted to emphasize that the new investors are young people, and that a lot of the motivation for ESG investing comes from young people. And I think that relates to the question that was just asked as well. Working from the bottom down is very much, I think, from the bottom up is very much, I think, what's behind ESG investing and business and human rights.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Mary. In other words, Milton Friedman may think that that's what the social responsibility, but increasingly investors, especially young investors, don't think that. And because
exactly
they don't think that, those investors are influencing and creating a lot of demand for these ESG standards.
You read Milton Friedman in order to know what comes next.
Yes. So there's a great question here that I want us to turn to now. It's from Vivek Krishnamurti, who is a Carr Center fellow and has followed these issues very carefully. And he said, this is more of a common comment than a question, but I'd love to find a way for this community, the Carr Center community, to continue to advance John's work, whether it's helping to complete the kinds of projects that Rachel just mentioned, or the larger project as well. So, he says it's a comment, but I wonder whether Matthias or others could just sort of say what, or could say what the Carr Center might be able to do, or whether Rachel and Anita or Mary have suggestions for us.
So I'd be eager to hear the suggestions also, but if I may just say from the Carr Center, and so yes, of course, and of course, Vivek, thank you for putting this in here. Of course, you have been a major source of support for what work we have been able to do in space already. So we have Carr Center has gotten quite invested in the whole human rights and technology domain in recent years, and of course that also always had this connection to the private sector. So we have done things ranging really from the occasional speaker presence to an actual convening with the UN entity that was trying to build a collaborative endeavor with private sector and universities. So we have been doing some things. And maybe for now, I just say we definitely plan on continuing that. So the future, one way or another, will be made by the private sector, and it's one of the missions of or at least the private sector will have a large share in it, and it's one of the missions of a human rights center to make sure that this will happen in ways that is respectful of human rights, and we are fully committed as Carr Center in that space, especially in the technology field.
And Matthias, I'll just say that one other, I think, invaluable resource that John helped lead was the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at the Kennedy School as well. So if there are ways in which the Carr Center and that initiative can continue, because I think the research outputs from that over the past decade have been invaluable to so many of us.
Mm-hmm.
I'd certainly, just a quick word, Katherine and Matthias, I'd certainly echo that from the Shift side. We've had a formal partnership with CRI since we founded Shift, and I'll never forget the sort of look on companies' faces when we said, yes, you can come to Harvard and you can sit in a room with John Ruggie and other people who know about all these things that you have questions about, and how excited they were, and how it transformed the kind of conversation that we could have with people in companies to be in a space like the university offers, to get away from the press of they have to meet the next milestone, they have to fill in the next financial reporting target, whatever it was, and to say, but what are we trying to do here? And we're actually a community who need each other and need to work together and need to learn about how to advance this practice. So it's I think quite a unique space, and obviously not just for companies, but for many other stakeholders as well to benefit from.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, very much for those suggestions. And I think we will continue to discuss this topic at the Carr Center, but also maybe call on you, panelists, for your suggestions, and ask Vivek as well to have us think about this, or the ways. There's just this big hole at the Kennedy School left by John's death. And so it's hard right now to think of how we could go about even beginning to fill that gap. But it's a very, very important question, and we will continue to think about and ask your help to think about it. In the short time we have remaining, there have been a lot. You've put a lot of great material in the chat for anyone who wants to follow up on some of these sources. But I had a few questions that I just wanted to go back to the panel about, in terms of things you mentioned in your remarks that you might want to just elaborate a bit more on. And so, Anita, you mentioned about the move towards some binding standards, especially at the EU, on these issues, kind of the movement from soft law to binding standards. I wonder if you could just spell out for us what's going on, what we should keep our eyes on in the future.
Sure. And I think, and it's really interesting, and it's quite similar to what we see in other areas where the EU or the European marketplace is moving faster than, let's say, the United States. But there's this idea, Pillar 2 of the guiding principles focuses on this concept of human rights due diligence, the process by which businesses identify their human rights impacts and then take steps to address them, mitigate them, and if necessary, to remediate them. What we're seeing now is a requirement coming out of different countries in Europe, including France was one of the first, but now the Netherlands, the parliament just announced that they are going to go ahead with legislation, Luxembourg as well, which will require companies, and not just companies that are based or domiciled in those areas, but companies of a certain size that are probably doing business in there. So these laws are going to require companies to have processes where they look into their supply chains, where they engage on these issues. And so I think that's really a big shift, right? So what it was a normative construct will now become a legal expectation. There's also another process underway at the UN, which is I can't foresee the future, but to negotiate a binding treaty focusing on business and human rights. Now that to me seems to be quite early, because we don't yet have that legislation and practice that would tell us what a good treaty might be like, but nonetheless, it's underway. So I think these are amazing shifts. And then the last piece is just modern slavery legislation. Even though that's not the full set of human rights in the US and in Australia and other places, we have laws that require companies to develop plans and to publish them focused on how they're addressing forced labor in their supply chains.
Mm-hmm. If I could just follow up with one question. I remember John at one point, because he knew of my interest in preventing mass atrocity, saying that if there was to be a treaty, he thought that one should start with a very focused one that already was deeply embedded in international law, and that would be the responsibility, the legal responsibility of corporations around issues of mass atrocity. Did that ever go anywhere?
No, so I think that's right. When he ended his mandate, he did make that recommendation that if there was going to be a treaty, it should focus on company responsibility with respect to these international crimes. My own research focused on that, because there in some countries under domestic law, you can prosecute a company for engaging in international crimes. An example of this is going on now in France with a particular company that has been connected to or alleged allegations relating to atrocity in Syria. And that case is being investigated and pursued. So I think what you're seeing now is just a broader potential treaty that will encompass mass atrocity, among other things. But I think, Katherine, your point is well taken, which is there a potential role for addressing this in that much more focused context? And I see Rachel might want to jump in too. Mm-hmm. Another international lawyer.
Well, it's a topic, I guess, close to all three of our hearts, because before I worked for John, I worked for the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. And one of the reasons why he initially hired me was to write a memo on the relevance of international criminal law to corporate accountability. And you're both absolutely right. It was one of the recommendations John made to the Human Rights Council at the end of his mandate. And I think it was the only one that states who were champions otherwise of the guiding principles and of his suggestions did not act on. And his recommendation was indeed about a more targeted instrument. And it was precisely to address what we see in practice, which is a lack of collaboration, cooperation between states in these cases, a failure to use existing channels that are there, to use universal jurisdiction where that's appropriate. Maybe we're starting to see some glimmers of Germany taking the lead on that, at least in the last few weeks. And Anita has mentioned the case in France, but I think the fact that states did not act at all on that recommendation created an unfortunate dynamic, because it made it seem as if the development of an international instrument was not envisaged in the guiding principles or with the guiding principles, when in fact it was. The vision of what that should be, I think, as Anita has said, still needs to and is being debated.
Just adding one point, and I know nothing about international law, so you two could help me on this, but I remember a bit of a discussion about, yes, targeted, as you said, Rachel, because it does bring people together on a particular focus. But again, if I could step back and say something about the big picture, to be careful that there not be too many different targets in too many different areas, that somehow, as you move along, you've got to try to bring them together organically.
Mary, since you were just talking about the big picture, I wonder, there's one thing I've been meaning to ask you about the relationship between John and Kofi Annan, right? This must have been just a life-changing set of encounters, or maybe one encounter. And, this is kind of essential to the practical dimension of the constructivism here, right? So that two great minds meet and they do stuff together. Can you elaborate a little bit about how that relationship came about?
When other people knew about John, Kofi, and so on, and brought them together for a lunch, and basically, Kofi was a very quiet person, but he certainly got his point across. And what he was impressed with John is that he wasn't going to get swallowed up in the inbox, and what the kind of respect that the two developed for each other, I think, was just magnificent. I think John has his own leadership qualities and had them before Kofi Annan, but he was able to articulate the fact that here is a leader who doesn't really have to say much and can garner respect and just get people to do something. So because the people didn't want to be disappointed, didn't want Kofi to be disappointed in them. And that kind of quiet charisma, I think is something that John developed as well. But yes, Kofi Annan was absolutely terrific with just getting the right points down very quick with the angels don't need our help and things along that line. And again, John fed him some of the big picture points.
So I wanted okay, we have one final question that I'm going to ask, where we only have 5 minutes left. It's from Robin Therakan. And she says, it is my understanding that the processes that Professor Weber initiated in developing the guiding principles also stood out and helped towards its adoption. I wondered, what are the key learnings, takeaways that other current efforts can replicate? For example, developing norms in cyberspace. So, can we learn from this this very successful norm building process, that lessons that could be taken to other issues? I wonder if Anita or Rachel would want to, or Matthias would want to make a stab at that one.
Rachel might want to go first because she was part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Invite the people in who are most likely to criticize before you do anything else. Get them to show you where the gaps are and work out how you would answer their critique. Don't exclude them from the process because you think that will make it stronger. It won't. And I guess that's what I was really getting at with John's desire to have as many good minds, including critical minds, including minds that didn't see the world exactly the way he saw it, in the mix, so that the final product would be stronger. Consult, and take what you hear on board and show people that you've taken it on board. That's the most powerful aspect of stakeholder engagement, that people can see how their input was treated with respect, and not just sort of cast aside or consulted for the sake of consultation. So those would be a couple of suggestions.
I'll just say that he's modeled that and his whole team, so Rachel and others, for us. So at the UN now, the success of the guiding principles is that we need to continue that tradition in terms of consult, but also bring everybody in to the discussion.
Right. So I would just add that when I teach global governance, there's an emerging wonderful literature about these multi-stakeholder initiatives, right, that are increasingly more important. And what's very interesting is there's an article that talks, we think that state consent is what matters, right? But there's a literature that sort of says, no, we want thick stakeholder consent. Thick stakeholder consent. I mean, and this is, I think, just what Rachel just said. You need to figure out who all the stakeholders are. You need to get them in the room, and it needs to be thick. It's not just one consultation, but kind of an ongoing process of involvement. And so I think I'm not sure if it can be replicated in other areas, but there is a kind of a map out there that about how to do it. I want to just end here by thanking all of the participants. I think this has been a very productive discussion and illuminating one. I want to remind the people listening that this is being recorded and that this will be made available on the Carr Center website. Matthias, I don't know exactly where it'll be available on the Carr Center website. It will be available on the Carr Center website, and it's a kind of resource that the Carr Center likes to make available to publics that can be used in other settings. So I'm already sitting here thinking how I'm going to use a clip of it to put on my course page in Canvas that my students can listen to before we discuss some of these issues in class. But it could be used in other kinds of educational settings. People in the audience may want to share it with others who couldn't be here today, but who will be interested in listening to it. So, so thank you again, especially to Mary for helping bring us together, and for your remarks today. Thank you very much to Anita and Rachel for your amazing expertise. And of course, as always, Matthias, for your leadership in all aspects regarding the Carr Center on this panel. So thank you, and we will never forget John's enduring contributions to our work. And good day.